Tenet, a film by Christopher Nolan, starts off at an opera house where these terrorists take siege of the opera house and hold these civilians hostage. John David Washington works for an agency we know nothing about. John David Washington and his team infiltrate the opera house with the SWAT team that goes in. John David Washington extracts this target that his team was supposed to capture, but John David Washington lets him go in exchange for some sort of device that looks like a piece of a dumbbell weight. All of this stuff goes over my head. Then it's discovered that some of the terrorists are disguised as the SWAT team members and they are placing bombs in the opera house as a decoy from what's really going on. And John David Washington tries to save all these people by collecting the bombs, but then we get our first moment of inversion where there's this mysterious character who we can only identify by having some sort of item hanging off the back of his backpack. So that's the first thing that interested me. The first thing that interested me about this movie was the mystery scattered throughout and how the reveals happened gradually. John David Washington saves all of these people, but the thing that I thought was funny is that when he grabbed all of the bombs and put them in a bag, threw them on the balcony inside the opera house as he was escaping, the bomb blew up. And so realistically, I said to myself, how does he know that this will not kill some people? Because when the explosion goes off, we see some of the rubble falling down onto the people that are asleep in the opera house. And then I'm thinking, wouldn't that balcony collapse due to the explosion? So I just was thinking this opening scene was a bit jarring because it's all moving so fast. I don't know what agency John David Washington is working for. I don't know what this item is. I don't know why he is supposed to capture this guy, but then he lets him go. There's all these questions. But then this organization he's working for captures him and they torture him. And it's a pretty cool scene. It's PG-13, so we don't get to see anything, but the way Christopher Nolan handles it, he handles it masterfully. One of John David Washington's team members gives John David Washington a cyanide capsule. John David Washington takes the capsule, but then he finds out later on when he wakes up in a hospital after a coma, this guy who I guess is the head of the organization tells John David Washington that the capsule was fake. This was a test, but then now I'm even more confused because how elaborate was this test? Like, was he really trying to save people or was it all a test entirely? I have no idea. There's so much stuff going on and it's moving so fast. But we have no idea who this organization is. We have no idea what John David Washington's character name is. We don't know what sort of skill set he has. Even John David Washington doesn't know what he's supposed to do. But the guy who I guess is the head of this organization gives John David Washington a word, Tenet. And then he's like, it can open some of the right doors, some of the wrong doors too. And he's like, all I have is a gesture and a word, Tenet. So John David Washington goes on this unknown mission. And as the film progresses, he's just gradually meeting people. He's going from place to place to place. And it's kind of hard to keep up. I had to watch the film twice. I've seen it twice just to try and figure out some of this information. Some of it is still confusing to me. But he meets this scientist lady who works for the same organization, but they don't reveal what their jobs are. She doesn't even give him the full story of what his mission is. She just gives him an idea. She explains that there's this bullet and it's been inverted, and then they explain the inversion to the audience, but then at the same time the movie just kind of says, don't even think about it, just feel it, don't try to understand it, but then they do have this conversation where he talks about, there's cause and effect. How did it come back into my hand if I didn't drop it? What about free will? But then she says, it's since it's inverted, your perception of it is something. I don't know how to explain it. They explain it later on, but He meets the scientist lady, and then she explains inversion to him and gives him an idea of what his mission is. Then he goes to meet Robert Pattinson, who knows a lot about him, which we'll get into later as well. So then they do this scene that we see in the trailer where they bungee jump on this building to talk to this guy who is an arms dealer or something, or a person who sold the bullets to this guy that they're looking for, who created the inversion stuff. And the bungee scene, it's a cool scene, but then there's a little nitpick where there are lots of conveniences in movies where there's a situation that is set up and it seems impossible, but then when they complete the objective, they use movie trickery. Whereas for this, when they bungee jump, there are these guards that are on the balcony that John David Washington and Robert Pattinson need to get on. And when they shoot the bungee cord up to the platform they need to get on, there's the guard just sitting there nonchalant, and John David Washington is able to sneak up behind him and choke him. And it was just kind of silly. It's like you got all of these armed guards and they can't even do their job. So it just felt like a movie convenience to me. But it's a small thing. But it's a pretty interesting scene because John David Washington is about to kill this guy if the guy doesn't give up the information, but then it's revealed that the guy's wife was actually a part of it. I don't really know what he was doing there, but he's there to get information to lead him to the next objective. So he gets his information, and then that leads him to Michael Caine. And he has dinner with Michael Caine. Michael Caine gives him some more information, and then now he goes on to his next objective. So then he acquires this fake painting. He meets this woman, and this woman's married to Kenneth Branagh's character. And I think the second greatest thing for me in this movie, besides the mystery, is Kenneth Branagh's performance. I thought he gave a fantastic performance. He is the best actor, gives the best performance in this whole movie. And I love Elizabeth Debicki's relationship to Kenneth Branagh as characters in this movie because she's in an abusive marriage with this guy, and the story really gets in deep with that. I think that's the emotional focal point of this movie, is that abusive relationship, because she's like explaining herself. Like there's a scene where there's a flashback where she talks about, yeah, my husband, we were on this boat and we went to Vietnam and I was angry at him and I wanted to leave him, and he gave me an ultimatum that if I leave him I can't see my kid anymore. So she's very mad at him, and their marriage is shit, and she's very depressed. So John David Washington is in the middle of this and he wants to meet Kenneth Branagh, but she's scared because her husband Kenneth Branagh is a ruthless man. And there's this cool action scene where I'm always complaining about Christopher Nolan and his fight scenes. Like in Batman Begins, Dark Knight Rises, I thought the fight scenes were kind of poorly choreographed. Whereas in Tenet, I think the fight scene in the kitchen is handled expertly. It's well done. I can see what's happening. I can make out the layout of the area. So I thought it was overall well executed. So then John David Washington fights all these goons, and then later on he hooks up with Robert Pattinson, and then they're supposed to do something at this airport where these paintings are, but I don't understand it because, like I said, this movie is moving so fast, going from place to place. It's just going all over the place, and it's sort of not that interesting to me. So Robert Pattinson goes to this airport, and then there's this scene where Robert Pattinson is trying to learn the layout of where all of these paintings are held. He's looking at the sprinkler system, and he's asking the guy who's giving him a tour of this area, he's asking him questions. He's saying, well, how does all of this work? And the guy explains it to him that there's a gas that goes off. If there's an emergency, it'll knock you out in 10 seconds if you're not clear. So then John David Washington and Robert Pattinson execute this plan to crash this plane, which is a cool scene, and I respect Christopher Nolan for using practical effects and not CGI. I don't know if he did use CGI in this movie, and if he did, it's barely noticeable if he did use it. But he mostly sticks with practical effects, and I appreciate that. I respect that. So the plane crashes into the side of this building. It explodes. All these gold bars fall out. This one dude steals it. And then Robert Pattinson, John David Washington execute their plan. The gas goes off. They hold their breath. They open each door to go into a new room. They go into this room where there's this chamber. The chamber opens. It's the scene we see in the trailer where this guy dressed in an all-black SWAT gear comes out. And there's another cool fight sequence where the SWAT member that John David Washington is fighting in reverse while John David Washington is fighting him forward in time. So it's a really cool action sequence, something we've never seen before. But the guy in the SWAT uniform gets away. And then there's another moment where Robert Pattinson, he's on the opposite end of this room, and a SWAT guy comes out of there. Robert Pattinson chases him, pulls off the guy's helmet, but we don't get to see his face because he's hiding behind a wall. And then Robert Pattinson just throws the helmet back to the guy and disappears. So then there's another element of mystery here. Because it's like, is Robert Pattinson a good guy or a bad guy? Who did he see? Why isn't he telling John David Washington anything? So then we move along and we have our scene where John David Washington finally meets Kenneth Branagh. Fast forwarding a little bit to a very interesting scene where John David Washington has a sit down at a party with Kenneth Branagh because he asked Elizabeth Debicki to give him an introduction to her husband. He has a sit down and it's Kenneth Branagh, fantastic performance. And this scene was very intense just with this dialogue, and I was visualizing this conversation in my head. But Kenneth Branagh's looking at John David Washington. He's like, "How would you like to die?" And John David Washington says, "I want to," he wants to die old. But then he's like, he chose the wrong profession. And then he tells him the story, which is very vivid. He says, what we're going to do, we're going to take you down this area and we're going to cut a hole in your throat. And then we're going to cut your balls off. And then we're going to stick your balls in your throat. And then he says something along the lines of, yeah, I think it's interesting to see a man try to pull his own balls out of his own throat. And so just seeing that scene, hearing the dialogue, I was visualizing all of that in my head. And I was like, oh, this guy's intense. Kenneth Branagh, fantastic performance out of everyone else in this movie, I think. So we have this interesting moment. And then fast forwarding some more, there's John David Washington trying to build a relationship with Kenneth Branagh. And Kenneth Branagh he just steals the scenery in this whole movie. And this little character trait that I enjoy from Kenneth Branagh is when he constantly looks at his watch and he checks his blood pressure. And he does it throughout the movie. And later on we learn he has cancer. And we'll get to that. But he's constantly looking at his watch every time he's like yelling and screaming. So it's a nice character trait. But he's a really shitty person because then John David Washington tries to set up this deal with Kenneth Branagh to steal some plutonium because Kenneth Branagh has some sort of device that he wants to use. The movie moves so fast, it's hard to keep up with all this stuff. And then some of the information I don't think is very important. But I think the vital, like an hour and a half into the movie, that's when it really gets going, I think, where the information is truly vital. For the first hour or so, it's just moving from place to place, meeting person, getting information. I don't really think it's all that interesting until we reach the hour and a half mark where we finally understand what's going on here. And we get our reveals, which is really what held my attention, the reveals and Kenneth Branagh's performance. So then John David Washington is spying on Kenneth Branagh at some meeting where this guy, I think, who stole the gold bar gives it back to Kenneth Branagh, but Kenneth Branagh beats the guy to death with the gold bar. Then John David Washington gets beat up, and then Kenneth Branagh is about to kill him, but then John David Washington is like, I can help you with something, get this plutonium, and then Kenneth Branagh is like, okay, but then John David Washington is like, I need the help from your wife, but Kenneth Branagh is like, I don't want to involve her, but then he reasons with Kenneth Branagh, and Kenneth Branagh agrees to the plan, and then there's this other intense scene with Kenneth Branagh, and we really get the depth of his marriage to Elizabeth Debicki and how horrifying it is when he's in this room and he has all these guns and Elizabeth Debicki's scared, and then she pulls a gun on Kenneth Branagh and he yells at her like, I'm the lion and all this, and then he hits her and then she's on the ground and then he's kicking her and screaming and all this stuff. And it was kind of funny too because she's so much taller than he is, and just looking at the size difference, she's so much taller and he's much shorter than her and he's beating her up. I just thought it was kind of interesting. But before that, though, I skipped ahead a little bit. Before that, though, there was another intense moment where it was John David Washington, Elizabeth Debicki, and Kenneth Branagh. They were on this boat of some sort, and John David Washington and Kenneth Branagh were talking, and Elizabeth Debicki is trying to kill Kenneth Branagh, and she throws him off of the boat, and then John David Washington saves him, and then Kenneth Branagh is mad at Elizabeth Debicki, but Elizabeth Debicki's mad at John David Washington because she's like, why did you save him? And then John David Washington is like, I need him alive. And John David Washington gives Elizabeth Debicki a gun to protect herself. And when Elizabeth Debicki's alone in her room, Kenneth Branagh comes in this really interesting moment where Kenneth Branagh walks into the room, he puts his cufflinks on the table, and then he takes his belt, puts one of the cufflinks in the hole of the belt, wraps the belt around his hand, and he's about to beat her, and then she says, yeah, don't do it. I'll bring John David Washington in here, and then Kenneth Branagh's like, don't let him get in my affairs, and he's yelling and screaming at her. It's like really intense stuff. But then we fast forward to the moment where he's like, I'm the lion, he beats her up, and she's on the ground and all this stuff. Then there's another interesting action moment here, and that's the thing I respect about Christopher Nolan, is not only he uses practical effects, but all of his action moments in his movies usually aren't just standard action. There's always some sort of really high theatrical element included, and this is no exception. There's a moment where there's a team that is taking this supposed plutonium or this orange case, and they're taking it someplace, and there's this whole setup where there's this fire truck that's aligned with where the case is next to this other truck, and then John David Washington and Robert Pattinson come in on a car in a BMW, and then John David Washington gets out of his car, goes on top of the fire truck, then the ladder that he's on moves to the spot where this case is on top of this other truck. So then John David Washington gets off that truck, plants this device that blows a little hole on the top of this truck where he's supposed to get the case. He goes into the hole, grabs the case, and then goes back to the BMW. Then there's this awesome moment where we see Elizabeth Debicki and Kenneth Branagh. And Kenneth Branagh, he's in reverse. The car is moving in reverse. And John David Washington and Robert Pattinson are moving forward. And Kenneth Branagh wants the case, so he's counting down with his fingers. And then there's this car in front of them that is tipped over. And then the car flips back over. And then the car's in between the BMW and the car where Kenneth Branagh is. John David Washington throws the case over the middle car, and it goes into Kenneth Branagh's car. And then Kenneth Branagh gets out of his car, escapes. John David Washington saves Elizabeth Debicki from her car, and it's that ticking clock moment where her car is about to crash into other cars, and he saves her in the nick of time. Then there's a shootout. Then a car crashes into the car John David Washington and Elizabeth Debicki are in, and then they capture them. And I thought this was kind of odd because they're in the middle of this gunfight, and Robert Pattinson is shooting. But then as soon as John David Washington gets captured, the gunfight just stops, and then we go to another scene. So I thought it ended kind of early. But I think it's explained a little later. So then there's this weird scene where John David Washington's captured, and they go into this warehouse, and then on the other side of this glass, everything is going backwards. Kenneth Branagh's talking backwards. He shoots Elizabeth Debicki in the torso with an inverted bullet. And it's just weird. I couldn't really make out what was going on. This is just stuff that goes over my head. But then Kenneth Branagh comes in because he doesn't know where the object that was in the case. He doesn't know where the object that was in the case is. He doesn't know where it is. I thought I saw John David Washington throw the case into what's the dude's name again? I thought I saw John David Washington throw the orange case into Kenneth Branagh's car, but apparently Kenneth Branagh didn't get the object. So John David Washington somehow took the object out of the case. So now Kenneth Branagh's looking for this object. And Kenneth Branagh comes into the room. He's like, where is it? John David Washington says, I left it in the car in the BMW. And then the SWAT team comes in, and Kenneth Branagh goes into the chamber, and then now he's disappeared, and then John David Washington wants to save Elizabeth Debicki. So then they go into the time. It's basically a time machine, I think. So they go into this time machine. So now they go into the past, and then they can see their future selves or their past self. No, they're in the future now. They go into the past, and then they can see their future selves on the other side of the room through this mirror. And so now they're inverted now, and then they explain the whole inversion thing. They have to wear these oxygen masks because since they're inverted, their lungs won't be able to handle the air pressure, so they need the oxygen masks to be able to breathe. They can't come into contact with their past selves if they're wearing the same clothes or something. I forgot how all of that is explained because it's just moving so fast. But this lady explains it to John David Washington. She's like, basically, the world around you is inverted. So everything is moving backwards. So then he goes outside, and then he gets in his car, and he's driving, and then he goes back in time to the car scene on the highway. And this is where the mysteries are revealed, and this is one of the most interesting parts of the movie, where we learn that the car that was flipped over was actually the car that John David Washington was in, so he comes into contact with his past self. So he's driving the car, and that car that was in the middle, in between Kenneth Branagh and John David Washington's future self is in the middle, and then his car flips over, so we learn that that was the car that he was in. And then Kenneth Branagh tries to blow up the car, but then, as the lady explained, I don't really know how it all works, but she says something like, fire will turn to ice or something like that. I don't know, it goes over my head. But he doesn't die, and then they try to save Elizabeth Debicki. And then now John David Washington, he wakes up in a cargo crate. But before that, we learn that since John David Washington went back in time and Kenneth Branagh was looking for the object, John David Washington led Kenneth Branagh to the object, so now Kenneth Branagh has this object, which is a doomsday device. He's going to blow up the whole world. And then John David Washington, after the explosion, he wakes up in this cargo crate, and then he's talking to Robert Pattinson. He wants to learn Robert Pattinson's backstory, but Robert Pattinson won't give him any information. He's like, if we survive, I'll give you some information. And they say, okay, how are we going to go back into the present time, I think? And they say, okay, we can just go back to where we had the airport crash since there was a time machine there. So we'll go in there and we'll come back into the present time. So then they get there, and then they're not inside of the holding area. So then they say, okay, our plan is we're going to wait for the plane crash to happen, and then we're going to sneak in there with Elizabeth Debicki, and we're going to go be back into the present time, I think. So then the crash happens, and then they come out, and they go back to the area where they were, where all the paintings were in this holding area. But then there's another mystery revealed, which is interesting, because then we learn that the past version of John David Washington was fighting the future version of himself in the hallway. So that SWAT member that came out of the chamber during that fight scene in the hall was actually the future version of John David Washington. So now he's fighting himself in the same way he fought himself earlier, but now it's just going backwards. So this is very interesting stuff. And he's fighting himself. And then it's also revealed that Robert Pattinson, because, okay, before we get to that, he's fighting himself. It goes in reverse. He goes back, the future version of John David Washington goes back into the chamber. Then he comes out on the other side where Robert Pattinson is. And then we learned that when Robert Pattinson was chasing the guy and pulled his helmet off, he learned that it was John David Washington. That's why he didn't say anything. So then he gets away. And then they save Elizabeth Debicki. Robert Pattinson puts her in the chamber. They save her. She comes out. And then John David Washington talks to Robert Pattinson and says, why didn't you tell me? And then Robert Pattinson says, what's done is done. What's happened is happened. If I would have told you what was going to happen, then things probably could have changed. It's like Doctor Strange and Tony Stark. He's like, is this the 1,000,001 thing? And he's like, if I tell you, it won't happen. It's kind of like that. But then they learn that Kenneth Branagh is dying from cancer. That's why he's always checking his blood pressure on his watch. And his whole saying is with his wife, and the reason he abuses her so much is, if I can't have you, no one can. And since he's dying, if I can't have the world, no one can. And I really kind of think it's a dumb thing. I don't really think the whole like, oh, if I die the world's going to explode. I don't think that. I just don't like that for some reason. I think it's kind of cringy or corny because it just makes me think of the Spawn movie with Michael Jai White, where we had Martin Sheen have do the same thing. He had a doomsday device attached to his heart, and if his heart stopped, the whole world would blow up. So I just thought it was kind of silly. But okay, so they learned that information, and then they need to find the they need to find Kenneth Branagh so he doesn't detonate the device. So then John David Washington tells Elizabeth Debicki, okay, here's what you need to do. You need to go to where he was the most happy because that's where he'll probably be. And it's where they were in Vietnam on the yacht. And John David Washington's like, you need to go there and you need to comfort him and he can't die until we disarm the device. Otherwise, everyone will die. So then she goes there and she's comforting Kenneth Branagh, making him happy while John David Washington, Robert Pattinson, and Aaron Taylor Johnson is in this movie. I was really shocked by that. I did not expect to see him. I haven't seen him in a long time. He's a great actor. So we got Aaron Taylor Johnson in here, and all three of them come up with a plan to go to the location where the device is, and there's two different teams. I think the red team is inverted, or is it the blue team? I can't remember, but there's a red team and a blue team. One of the teams are inverted, one of the teams are moving forward. So one team's in the past, one team's in the present. So then they come up with their plan, their strategy, they go to the location, there's this huge battle, pretty interesting, everything's moving in reverse. It kind of reminded me of Doctor Strange in the end of that movie where everything was destroyed and then Doctor Strange used the time stone to rewind everything and everything's going in reverse, so it kind of looked like that. It's pretty cool. One guy got stuck behind a wall because the wall was filling itself back up and the guy couldn't get out in time. There was this tower that was collapsing or it was building itself back up, but then they shot it down, so as it was building itself up it got shot down again, so it's pretty cool stuff. John David Washington and Aaron Taylor Johnson go into this tunnel and they go over this tripwire. It explodes. They're trapped. Aaron Taylor Johnson gets shot. John David Washington's stuck behind some bars. And then, what's that guy? Then Kenneth Branagh is giving his whole spiel about why he's doing what he's doing and how the world is going to end and all this. So he's talking to John David Washington over the phone while he's on the yacht. And then Elizabeth Debicki is still, goofing around. And this is real confusing because then there's this whole, confrontation. And then somehow Robert Pattinson, it's another reveal that Robert Pattinson is the guy who saved John David Washington at the beginning, because and while they're in the cave, John David Washington looks down and he sees the same guy with the item on the back of the bag from the beginning, and he gets up and then he shoots the goon that's in the room, and then somehow John David Washington and Aaron Taylor Johnson's not dead. He gets up and they open the gate and then they disarm the bomb, and then Elizabeth Debicki, in this really awesome moment, shoots Kenneth Branagh in the chest. But she shoots him prematurely, so they kind of build this thing where it's like if she kills him too soon, you have to wait till we disarm the bomb. But they disarm it, but she doesn't know that though. But she's so pissed off. There's like this really awesome moment. She kind of I don't remember exactly what she said, but she shows the scar that Kenneth Branagh left her when he shot her, and she says, "I'm the bitch that has the scar on the outside. You gave me scars on the inside. Now I have actual scars on the outside." So she shoots him. And this other really gruesome moment in the movie where she pushes him over the edge of the yacht and we see his body flap like a rubber ducky and he hits the bars on the side of the yacht and you hear this thud this bing sound when he hits the bars, and it just looks so horrifying. But then he deserved it because he was an asshole to her. So he gets that moment where it's like, yeah, the villain dies in a horrific way, and he falls over the edge. And then Elizabeth Debicki sees her past self because she was already there. So then she jumps off the side of the yacht. And earlier in the movie, when Elizabeth Debicki was telling John David Washington the story about what happened that day, she said, yeah, this is that my husband vanished, and then I saw this woman jump off the side of the yacht. So then, yes, Elizabeth Debicki's future self, or her past self, saw her future self. So that was pretty interesting. And then, yeah, John David Washington and the team save the day. And then John David Washington confronts Robert Pattinson and says, "Oh, you're the guy who saved my life," and because he recognizes the item on the backpack from the beginning. Then it's revealed that Robert Pattinson is an old friend of John David Washington, but he just hasn't met him yet. They haven't met each other yet. So it's kind of like Terminator with John Connor and Kyle Reese, where it's like, "Oh, you're my father, but I'm going to send you to the future where I haven't been born yet and where you haven't existed yet." So it's kind of like that. So it's kind of like different movies in this one movie here. But it's a touching moment. I felt it because John David Washington was crying. So I felt the emotion of it a little bit, where Robert Pattinson walks off. Well, they disarm the device, and Aaron Taylor Johnson's about to shoot him because they're like, "We need to take this to the grave." But then he's like, "Never mind." But then Robert Pattinson gives a piece of his device to John David Washington. Now John David Washington has these devices, and then Aaron Taylor Johnson has a device. And as Robert Pattinson's walking away, John David Washington, he's like, "You knew all along." And Robert Pattinson's like, "Yeah, we'll be old friends. For me, this is the end of our journey, but for you, it's the beginning." So it was pretty touching. I like that. And then we learned that John David Washington is a guy who creates Tenet in the future. He creates the time devices or something like that. He's like, "I'm the protagonist, and he's going to save the day." So he learns what his destiny is. And the woman that he met at the beginning, I think, who was the weapons dealer or whatever, or I don't know, but he runs into her at the end and he kills her because she was about to kill Elizabeth Debicki. Because earlier in the movie, when John David Washington was upset and tried to explain to her like where these doomsday devices were, and they were having a conversation about that, he says that, "Yeah, I'm getting Elizabeth Debicki involved, but then when all this is over, I want you to give me your word that she'll be safe." So the Indian woman said, "Yeah, I'll make sure she's safe," but coming to find out, she lied. So at the end, this Indian woman is about to kill Elizabeth Debicki and her son, but John David Washington won't let that happen. So he kills the woman, and Elizabeth Debicki walks off into the sunset with her son, which is what she wanted this whole time. Because there was another awesome moment where when Elizabeth Debicki was talking to John David Washington about her son, and when Kenneth Branagh said, "If you leave me, you never get to see your son again," and Elizabeth Debicki said, "I thought about that, and I was hesitant for a moment, and then that will forever haunt me because Kenneth Branagh's character has this hold on me," and all this kind of stuff. So that was, like I said, that's the second thing that I was most interested in. So yeah, John David Washington says, "I'm the protagonist," and he saves Elizabeth Debicki and her son from being killed. Elizabeth Debicki and her son walk off into the sunset. And that's the end of the movie. And so overall, with that, there is a whole lot going on in this movie. It's extremely fast-paced, too fast-paced for my liking. Even watching it a second time, the first hour of it, I'm not interested because it goes from this location to this location, and I don't care. I don't know what organization John David Washington's working for. His name's the protagonist, which I think is silly. There's some silly things in here. So like the first hour, I'm not that invested. Like the first viewing, it's like, this is fresh. I don't know what's happening. So that's the one thing that kept me interested, is because I didn't know what was going on. The first thing that kept me involved in this movie from beginning to end is the mystery. But then the second time, it's like once you know everything that's happening, it's not that interesting anymore for me for the first hour. But then at the hour and a half mark, is when it really revs up once we see the reveals. So once everything is revealed, then I'm like, okay, we learn who the guy was that had the item on the back of his bag. It's Robert Pattinson. We learn who the SWAT guy is that came out of the chamber that John David Washington was fighting. He was fighting his future self. And then the car that was flipped over, John David Washington was in that car. So he runs into himself multiple times. So those moments are really good. The ending action scene, there was too much going on, so I wasn't that interested in it, but it looked cool. It was cool, but I wasn't that interested in it. So, like, yeah, the hour and a half mark, I'm involved because of the reveals. I love the relationship between Kenneth Branagh and Elizabeth Debicki, mostly because Kenneth Branagh and Elizabeth Debicki's performance. Kenneth Branagh gives the best performance in this whole movie. And then when he dies, mwah, fantastic. He got what he deserved, so I love that whole dynamic. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, the only two things that kept me involved was the mystery, the reveals, and the relationship between Elizabeth Debicki and Kenneth Branagh. And then the time inversion stuff with the whole, oh yeah, John David Washington, his future self is fighting his past self. All that stuff was cool. But other than that, this movie, it's a good movie. It's a good movie, but it just, the first hour, I don't care. Then the hour and a half in, I'm interested. But then watching it the second time, I don't think it holds up as much because now you know everything. There's some stuff that I still don't know because it goes over my head. But other than that, yeah, it's a good movie. It's not my favorite Christopher Nolan movie. For me, my top 5 is Inception, The Dark Knight, Following, Memento, and The Prestige. So Tenet isn't in my top 5, but I think it's better than Interstellar, and I think it's probably better than Dunkirk, somewhere around in there. But yeah, that's all I have to say. So thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next time.